U.S. aviation crash investigators are in Monterey County, California tonight, trying to determine the cause of an accident that killed John Denver.
2,900 feet per second.
The plane crashed into the sea. The accident report concluded that it had run out of fuel and that John had been unable to switch to the reserve tank. He was killed instantly.
Everyone thought they knew John Denver. To the world, he was the guy in the granny glasses and the denim vest, singing about sunshine and country roads.
John Denver was no longer in the limelight, but during the mid-1970s, he was America's most successful solo singer.
He was safe. He was uncool. But behind that far-out catchphrase was a man the FBI viewed as a threat. A man who trained for spaceflight, and a rebel who broke the Iron Curtain with a guitar. These are the stories people called myths until the cameras started rolling. The accidental outlaw. To the average observer, John Denver was the human equivalent of a warm hug. But to the United States government, he was a potential radical with a massive platform. It sounds like a punchline. Why would the FBI care about a guy who sang about Rocky Mountain High?
John Denver was to the 70s.
From country roads to Rocky Mountain High.
In the 70s, Denver was one of the most famous men on the planet, and that kind of influence terrified the establishment. While contemporaries like Hendrix were watched for overt rebellion, Denver was monitored because he was actually effective. He was the subversive that your grandmother invited into her living room every single night. The FBI began keeping a file on Denver, largely due to his association with the anti-war movement. At a 1971 protest, he didn't just show up. He stood as a symbol of Middle American dissent. This was dangerous for the government because Denver wasn't a hippie they could easily dismiss as a fringe radical. He was the golden boy. If he was against the war, then the heart of America was against the war. His file grew as he spoke out, documenting his every move as if he were a high-level spy rather than a folk singer. But the outlaw label wasn't just about his politics. It was about a perceived substance culture that he inadvertently came to represent. When Denver released Rocky Mountain High in 1972, he unintentionally started a war with the FCC. Radio stations across the country banned the song, convinced that the high he was singing about wasn't the thin mountain air of Aspen, but a chemical one. Denver was genuinely baffled. He spent months explaining that he was talking about the spiritual euphoria of nature, not narcotics. He eventually had to defend his lyrics before the Senate, standing as an unlikely defender of artistic expression against bureaucratic overreach. This friction culminated in the infamous 1985 PMRC hearings. When Tipper Gore began pushing for parental advisory stickers, they expected Denver to be their poster boy for wholesome values. They thought he would help them clean up music. Instead, he walked into that hearing and blindsided them. He didn't just defend rock and roll. He compared record labeling to Nazi book burning. He argued that once you start censoring offensive lyrics, you eventually censor the truth. The man who looked like he'd never broken a speed limit was secretly a fierce defender of the First Amendment, willing to bite the hand of the conservative establishment that loved him. He wasn't trying to be a rebel. He just couldn't stand being told what he could or couldn't say. He was an outlaw of conscience, proving that you don't need a leather jacket to be a threat to the status quo. Sometimes, all you need is a 12-string guitar and a refusal to back down. But while Denver was busy fighting the powers that be on Earth, his eyes were actually fixed much higher than the Colorado peaks he loved so much. The space cowboy. While the FBI was busy tracking his movements on the ground, Denver was looking toward the stars with a seriousness that most people dismissed as a celebrity whim. They were wrong. John Denver didn't just want to watch a rocket launch, he wanted to be on top of one. This wasn't some PR stunt dreamed up by a manager to make a folk singer look edgy. Denver was a true believer in the final frontier, and he was willing to put his body and his reputation on the line to get there. The story sounds like a tall tale. The sunshine boy in a flight suit, pulling GS in a centrifuge. But the reality is that Denver was one of the leading candidates for NASA's Citizen in Space program.
He loved NASA, he loved the space program, he loved the lofty dream of actually going into outer space.
Long before he was considered for the ill-fated Challenger mission, Denver had been lobbying NASA for years. He wasn't just a casual fan. He was a pilot with thousands of hours under his belt and a deep, technical understanding of aviation. He saw space not as a Cold War battlefield, but as the ultimate country road, a place that could unite humanity in a way that music only hinted at. In the early 80s, Denver actually underwent the rigorous physical and mental testing required for spaceflight. He didn't get a celebrity pass. He went through the same grueling evaluations as the professional astronauts. He was spun in the Vomit Comet, subjected to high-pressure chambers, and passed every single test with flying colors. NASA officials were reportedly stunned by his physical condition and his genuine aptitude for flight mechanics. He wasn't just a passenger, he was a peer. The Space Cowboy moniker became literal when he was named as a finalist for the flight that would eventually carry Krista McAuliffe. When he wasn't chosen, he didn't sulk. Instead, he channeled his energy into advocacy. He became a founding member of the Planetary Society and sat on the board of the National Space Institute. He used his fame to secure funding for programs that the public was beginning to lose interest in. He believed that if a poet or a singer could look back at the pale blue dot, they could explain the fragility of Earth better than any scientist could. But there's a darker, more haunting side to this obsession. On January 28, 1986, Denver was at the Kennedy Space Center watching the Challenger lift off. He had written a song for the occasion called "Flying for Me." As the shuttle broke apart in the Florida sky, Denver stood among the families and NASA staff, devastated. He later admitted that he felt a profound sense of survivor's guilt. If the selection had gone another way, it would have been him in that cockpit. Even after the tragedy, he never stopped trying. He even entered talks with the Soviet Union to pay for a seat on a Soyuz mission to the Mir space station, a move that would have cost him millions and likely labeled him a traitor in the eyes of the U.S. government. To Denver, the risk was irrelevant. He didn't just want to sing about the world. He wanted to see it from a perspective that changed everything. Yet, his quest for the stars didn't distract him from the battles brewing back in the dirt and trees of his own backyard. The Rocky Mountain War. While Denver was dreaming of the silence of space, he was becoming increasingly loud about the noise being made in the American wilderness. Most people assumed his environmentalism was just about hugging trees and writing pretty melodies, but the reality was far grittier. In the late 70s and early 80s, the Rocky Mountain High wasn't just a song, it became a battle cry for a man who was increasingly viewed as a nuisance by some of the most powerful industries in the world. John Denver wasn't just an activist. He was becoming a target. The public saw the smile, but the corporate boardrooms of big oil and mining companies saw a threat to their bottom line. Denver didn't just donate money, he showed up. He used his personal wealth to buy up vast tracts of land in Colorado, not to build mansions, but to keep them wild. He founded the WinStar Foundation on 1,000 acres of land, turning it into a laboratory for sustainable living and alternative energy long before green was a buzzword. This wasn't a hobby, It was a crusade that pitted him directly against the industrial giants of the West. Because of this, the Sunshine Boy began receiving very real, very dark threats. During the height of his environmental advocacy, Denver's office and home received a string of death threats that were credible enough to require private security. It was a jarring contrast. The man who sang about peace and harmony was living under the shadow of violence. He was warned that if he didn't stop opposing certain land use projects and oil pipelines, there would be consequences. For a guy who just wanted to sing about the beauty of life, he was suddenly looking over his shoulder every time he stepped onto a stage. Denver's environmentalism was also deeply intertwined with his global vision. He realized that pollution didn't stop at borders, which led him to create the Hunger Project. This wasn't just about giving out sandwiches. It was an ambitious, data-driven attempt to end world hunger by the year 2000. He used his fame to get into rooms with world leaders, from Jimmy Carter to Fidel Castro, pushing a message that environmental health and human survival were the same thing. He was one of the first celebrities to use his platform for holistic activism, connecting the dots between poverty, the environment, and global peace. The Rocky Mountain War also took a toll on his public image. The more he spoke out about the rape of the land, the more the media began to paint him as an eccentric or a radical. The music industry, which preferred their stars to be compliant and brand-friendly, started to distance itself. Denver didn't care. He famously said that if he had to choose between being a star and being a steward of the earth, he'd pick the earth every time. He was essentially trying to save a world that was increasingly making fun of him for caring so much. This period of his life proved that Denver had a spine of steel beneath that denim jacket. He took the hits, the threats, and the ridicule because he believed he had a responsibility to the land that gave him his music. He wasn't just a singer, he was a frontline soldier in the early days of the environmental movement, fighting a war that most people wouldn't even acknowledge existed for another 30 years. But the constant pressure of being the world's moral compass started to crack the glass on his perfect public image, revealing a much darker personal struggle. The dark side of sunshine. Behind the far-out catchphrases and the infectious grin, the weight of being America's wholesome spokesman was slowly crushing John Denver. It is a classic Hollywood tragedy. The man who brought light to millions was privately struggling with an encroaching darkness. To the public, he was a living saint. To himself, he was a man failing to live up to his own impossible brand. By the early 80s, the Sunshine Boy image wasn't just a persona. It was a cage. The most shocking crack in the facade came during the disintegration of his first marriage to Annie Martell, the woman immortalized in Annie's song. The world viewed their relationship as the ultimate folk rock fairy tale, but behind closed doors, it was fractured by the pressures of his relentless touring and his growing ego. When the divorce papers were finally filed, Denver's reaction was anything but peaceful. In a fit of localized rage that felt like a scene out of a psychological thriller, he took a chainsaw to the couple's custom-made oak kitchen table. He literally sawed the heart of their home in half. It was a visceral, violent manifestation of a man who no longer knew how to process his own pain without destroying something beautiful. This wasn't an isolated incident of rock star behavior. It was a symptom of a deeper battle with alcohol. Denver had a complicated relationship with the bottle that haunted him for the last 2 decades of his life. He wasn't a party animal in the traditional sense. He was a functional alcoholic who used drink to numb the isolation of fame and the sting of a waning career. The industry that once worshipped him had moved on to the neon glitz of the 80s, leaving Denver feeling like a relic. He was arrested multiple times for driving under the influence, incidents that his PR team worked overtime to bury. Each mugshot was a devastating blow to a man whose entire career was built on being the good guy. But the darkness wasn't just about substances or temper. It was about a profound, clinical loneliness. Friends described him as someone who could hold a stadium of 20,000 people in the palm of his hand, but couldn't hold a conversation in a room of 4. He was a perfectionist who demanded total loyalty but struggled to give it in return. This internal friction led to intense bouts of depression. There were days when the man who sang about sunshine on my shoulders couldn't bring himself to get out of bed. He felt like a fraud, a cardboard cutout that the world had created, and he felt obligated to keep that cutout standing even as his real self was crumbling. Even his philanthropy, which was genuine, had a compulsive edge to it. He would fly across the globe to save a forest or feed a village, often to the detriment of his own mental health and his relationships with his children. He was trying to heal the world because he couldn't figure out how to heal himself. This period of his life is often glossed over in documentaries because it doesn't fit the Denver brand, but it's actually the most human part of his story. He wasn't a cartoon of positivity. He was a deeply flawed man who felt every bit of the world's weight. The dark side of sunshine is a reminder that nobody gets to be that famous without paying a price. Denver's price was his peace of mind. By the time he reached his 50s, he was a man living in 2 worlds: the public one, where he was still the guy from The Muppet Show, and the private one, where he was fighting a daily battle with regret, resentment, and the bottle. He was a man desperately searching for the home he sang about, only to realize that he had lost the map along the way. Yet, even as his personal life became a storm, Denver found a way to use his global stature to do something no other Western artist had the guts to attempt during the height of the Cold War. The diplomatic maverick. While his personal life was a tempest, Denver decided to step onto the most volatile stage in the world, the front lines of the Cold War. In the mid-80s, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was at a snapping point, yet Denver believed his music could serve as a bridge across the Iron Curtain. He didn't just talk about diplomacy, he became a rogue diplomat, navigating a maze of KGB handlers and State Department warnings to become the first American superstar to tour the USSR. The logistics were a nightmare. The Soviet government didn't know what to make of him. Was he a spy? A propagandist? A naive dreamer? They settled on unpredictable. Denver insisted on performing in places where Westerners weren't allowed, and he demanded that his concerts be accessible to ordinary citizens, not just Communist Party elites. In Moscow and Leningrad, he stood before thousands of Russians who had grown up viewing Americans as the Great Satan. When he struck the first chords of Annie's song, the room didn't just listen, it wept. He proved that the enemy had the same heart as the folks back in Aspen. This wasn't just a musical tour, it was a high-stakes chess match. Denver was followed by secret police, his hotel rooms were bugged, and every word he spoke between songs was scrutinized for anti-Soviet sentiment. Yet, he refused to be intimidated. He spoke openly about peace and environmentalism, topics that were often censored in the Eastern Bloc. He was essentially doing the work the politicians couldn't or wouldn't do. He was humanizing the other side for an American public that was being told to prepare for nuclear war. His diplomatic reach didn't stop at the Soviet border. He took his guitar to China at a time when the country was still deeply insular. He performed Country Roads in Beijing, and to his shock, the audience knew the words. They had been listening to bootleg tapes for years. Denver realized that his music had a borderless quality that bypassed political ideologies. He was a global citizen long before the internet made the world a smaller place. However, this maverick diplomacy came with a price. Back home, some critics labeled him a communist sympathizer or a useful idiot for the Kremlin. They couldn't understand why he was singing to the people who had missiles pointed at Washington. Denver's response was simple. You don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies. He was willing to risk his reputation and his all-American brand to prove that a song was more powerful than a physical wall. By the time he returned from these tours, he had fundamentally changed the way international cultural exchange functioned. He had opened doors that had been locked for decades, proving that the Sunshine Boy had a world-class set of nerves. He wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a man who had stared down the KGB with a smile and a 12-string guitar, and somehow he had won. As he mastered the art of crossing international borders, his ultimate fascination remained with the boundary between the earth and the sky, a fascination that would lead to his final, most controversial chapter. The Tech Visionary. While the world looked at John Denver and saw a simple folk singer, the aviation community saw something else. A highly skilled, obsessive pilot with a deep-seated love for experimental technology. Denver wasn't just a guy who flew to get from point A to point B. He was a tech visionary who was fascinated by the mechanics of flight and the pushing of boundaries. This wasn't a hobby for him, it was a secondary career. He owned everything from a vintage biplane to a Learjet. But his ultimate fascination was with the home-built movement. Planes that were lighter, faster, and more efficient than anything the big manufacturers were producing. This technical obsession eventually led him to the Long Easy, a Rutan-designed aircraft that looked more like a spaceship than a plane. It was a canard design, meaning the small wing was at the front and the engine was at the back. It was sleek, futuristic, and notoriously difficult to master. To Denver, this plane represented the future of aviation. A way to fly that was as clean and efficient as the solar-powered homes he'd built in Colorado. He didn't see it as a risk. He saw it as the ultimate expression of human ingenuity. The controversy surrounding his final flight on October 12, 1997, has led to decades of urban legends, but the technical truth is far more human. Critics often point to his history with alcohol, but the toxicology reports were clear. Denver was completely sober when he took off from the Monterey Peninsula. The issue wasn't the man's state of mind. It was a fatal design flaw in that specific modified aircraft. The fuel selector valve, the switch that allows a pilot to change tanks, had been placed in an awkward position behind the pilot's left shoulder. Because Denver was flying a near-empty experimental craft, he had to reach back and turn that valve mid-flight. To do so, he had to take his feet off the rudder pedals and twist his entire body. It was a physical impossibility to do this without inadvertently pushing on the right rudder pedal. When he did, the plane banked sharply, and because he was at a low altitude over the Pacific, there was no time to recover. The tech visionary wasn't killed by a lack of skill, but by a mechanical quirk in a machine he was trying to master. The tragedy was that Denver was actually in the middle of a massive personal and professional comeback. He had just finished a series of successful shows, his voice was stronger than ever, and he was working on new ways to integrate technology into his environmental work. He was even looking into early versions of digital music distribution, decades before the rest of the industry caught on. He saw a world where technology and nature could coexist, where a high-tech composite plane could take you to a pristine wilderness without the heavy footprint of traditional travel. Ultimately, Denver's legacy as a tech visionary is often overshadowed by the Sunshine Boy myth. But his contributions to aviation and his willingness to test the limits of human-powered flight were revolutionary. He died exactly how he lived, pushing a boundary, testing a new idea, and looking toward the horizon. He wasn't just a passenger in the 20th century, he was one of its most daring, if misunderstood, pilots. This drive to innovate didn't just stop at cockpit controls, it extended into a quiet, massive legacy that continues to feed the planet today. The unseen legacy. While the world was busy mourning the singer, they missed the fact that John Denver had quietly built a global infrastructure for change that outlasted his hits. If you look past the greatest hits albums, you find the fingerprints of a man who was obsessed with the idea of systemic change. He didn't just want to give a man a fish. He wanted to change the way the entire world thought about the ocean. His most profound, unseen legacy is undoubtedly the Hunger Project.
By the Hunger Project UK and the legendary international artist.
In 1977, when most celebrities were focusing on disco and decadence, Denver co-founded an organization with the audacious goal of ending chronic hunger by the turn of the century. He didn't just sign checks, he sat through grueling strategic planning sessions. He understood that hunger wasn't a problem of not enough food, but a problem of not enough will. He used his fame to lobby the UN and the White House, forcing world leaders to look at poverty not as an inevitability, but as a solvable technical glitch. Today, the organization still operates in over 12 nations, reaching millions of people. A feat that often goes unmentioned in his musical retrospectives. Then there is his musical DNA, which has seeped into the very fabric of modern pop and country. Long before Taylor Swift or Ed Sheeran were genre-blurring superstars, Denver was the original crossover king. He was the first artist to dominate the pop, country, and adult contemporary charts simultaneously, proving that acoustic didn't have to mean niche. He paved the way for the stadium folk era, showing that a guy with a guitar could fill an arena just as easily as a rock band with a wall of Marshall amps. Every time you hear a modern artist blend a mandolin with a pop hook, you're hearing the echo of the trail Denver blazed through the industry. Even his environmental work has aged incredibly well. The Windstar Foundation became a blueprint for the off-grid and sustainable living movements that are now mainstream. He was talking about solar power, organic farming, and water conservation in the mid-70s, back when most people thought those were the delusions of a madman. He wasn't just a singer. He was a prototype for the modern conscious celebrity, proving that you could be a massive commercial success while maintaining a radical commitment to the planet. We've spent decades looking at the postcard version of Denver, but as we've seen, the real man was much more complicated and far more interesting. The final verdict. So, what is the final verdict on the man they called the Sunshine Boy? For decades, the world was content with the two-dimensional version of John Denver, the guy on the album cover with the easy smile and the denim vest. He was the safe choice, the singer your parents liked, the man whose music felt like a warm breeze through an aspen grove. But as we've peeled back the layers, it's clear that this postcard-perfect image was only half the story. The real John Denver was a man of startling contradictions, a complex figure who lived a life that was far more rock and roll in spirit than the industry ever gave him credit for. He was a man who felt the weight of the world on his shoulders and actually tried to lift it. While his peers were chasing trends, Denver was chasing the future. He was a pioneer who saw the potential of space, the fragility of the environment, and the power of global diplomacy long before they became standard celebrity causes. He wasn't just a singer, he was an accidental outlaw, a tech-obsessed pilot, and a rogue diplomat who walked into the heart of the Cold War with nothing but a 12-string guitar. He was a man who survived the vomit comet of NASA training, but couldn't always survive the quiet of his own kitchen without a drink. We were so ready to believe the simple version of him because it was comfortable. It's easier to categorize someone as a wholesome folk singer than to grapple with a man who could be a fierce First Amendment warrior one day and a struggling, lonely soul the next. But the complex version of Denver, the one who sawed his kitchen table in half, the one who stared down the KGB, and the one who died testing the limits of an experimental aircraft, is actually the version worth remembering. That man had grit. That man had a spine made of Colorado granite. His legacy isn't just in the 33 million albums sold or the songs that have become the unofficial anthems of entire states. His legacy is the fact that he used his massive uncool platform to demand a better world. He proved that you could be a global superstar and still be a human being who makes mistakes, gets angry, and feels a profound sense of duty to the planet. He wasn't a cardboard cutout. He was a visionary who was often decades ahead of his time, waiting for the rest of us to catch up to the Rocky Mountain high he had found long ago. Ultimately, John Denver's story is a reminder that there is almost always a deeper truth beneath the surface of a public persona. He was a dreamer who actually did the work, a pilot who wasn't afraid to crash, and a singer who understood that the most important notes are the ones that resonate after the music stops. He may have been America's sweetheart, but he was also its most unlikely rebel. And in the end, that's a much better story than the one we thought we knew. Click subscribe to not miss future uploads in our channel.